watching Press TV's news review, where we look deeper into some of the top stories of the day. Stay tuned, everybody. On this edition of the News Review, China has dismissed U.S. criticism of its plan to hold military maneuvers in the South China Sea, saying the exercises are China's sovereign right.
The
Xisha Islands are China's inherent territory, and there is no dispute over them. It is within China's sovereignty to conduct military exercises in relevant waters of the Xisha Islands, and it is beyond reproach.
Beijing says certain non-regional countries travel a long way to conduct large-scale military activities and flex their muscles in the South China Sea. The Chinese government also stresses that such measures are the root cause of instability in the region. The U.S. has conducted multiple naval operations by sending its warships through the area. China kicked off 5-day drills near the Xisha Islands in early July. The islands are claimed by both Vietnam and China. The U.S., Vietnam, and the Philippines have expressed concern about the Chinese drills. The Pentagon said conducting military exercises over the disputed territory is counterproductive. Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have political commentator Jason Unruhe joining us from Niagara Falls. Also, we have managing editor of Veterans Today, Jim W. Dean, joining us from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Jason Unruhe, what do you think about China's dismissal of the U.S. criticism? The U.S. says that basically it's criticizing China for holding military maneuvers in the South China Sea. China says that it's their sovereign right. Where does the U.S. fall into the picture here?
Well, I think it's very clear that this is Chinese territory, and China has every right to carry out any kind of military exercise in order to practice defending their country from any kind of external threat. I mean, every country in the world does this. Every single country practices uses their force to practice carrying out defense. So there's nothing new in this regard. Frankly, I think a lot of this situation, U.S. involvement, is really only because oil was found in the area, and the U.S. sees China as a global competitor for global influence. So when you have this situation, obviously, if Vietnam, who's known to be a close ally of the United States, were to get a hold of these islands, then U.S. oil companies would certainly move in and make a great deal of money. I think that in the end, for China, this is about territorial integrity. Meanwhile, for the United States, this is about the oil profits that could be snatched up in this situation. And also, it would be a huge slight to China to take some of their islands for themselves. So I see this as largely, it is a global conflict kind of situation, but this does eventually come down to politics and money.
Jim W. Dean, Beijing says certain non-regional countries travel a long way to conduct large-scale military activities and flex their muscles in the South China Sea. It's surely alluding to the United States. Give us your thoughts on the tensions that are stirring up with regards to the military maneuvers taking place there.
Well, we have what's obviously just another page in the growing Cold War, which the U.S. is committed to publicly. And we've had this ongoing process of the U.S. showing that they want to try to encircle China and Russia, bringing military power closer to their borders to be able to threaten first strike capability. And this is something that we see is not covered in the press very much. This whole idea of freedom of navigation, the laws on that were based on making sure that the country's ports could not be brought under cannon fire by possibly an enemy nation. So they had this boundary of 15 miles or 12 miles or whatever that you were not allowed to bring warships within that range. But now when you have warships that carry weapons that can travel huge distances and now you have weapons that also are going to be hypersonic. It's a really outdated concept to say, oh, we have a right to bring a huge military armada within 16 or a mile outside your borders, where we can shoot weapons, and within less than maybe 2 minutes, we can destroy all of your ports, your border defenses. So it's really a get in your face. We have massively more Navy military power than you do, and we're going to use it to intimidate you and basically keep you bottled in. And of course, as our previous guest said, the oil, anywhere where they can contest that they have the right to do oil, your oil barons are going to have no problem whatsoever getting their government to support any tenuous claim whatsoever.
Back to Jason. The Pentagon said conducting military exercises over the disputed territory is counterproductive. Korea, the Korean Peninsula comes to mind. The Persian Gulf comes to mind. The South China Sea comes to mind. Is the United States really in a place to talk about what is productive and counterproductive?
Well, frankly, no. I mean, you could see this as counterproductive if the islands weren't really under dispute. I mean, I highly doubt the idea that these islands are under dispute. I think they very clearly do belong to China. I think the United States is playing a game here to try to undermine Chinese influence in the region. But the U.S. is certainly no country to hold any kind of moral high ground in this situation. U.S. naval fleets feel free to go wherever it is that they want, anytime they want, and frequently do so while threatening the countries that they are going near. We saw with the U.S. Navy threatening to go into the Strait of Hormuz to quote guarantee their shipments or the free passage of vessels when a UK freighter was caught violating the rules. So the U.S. can come in, they can go to the Korean Peninsula and practice invading the North without, any real consequences to their actions. I mean, this is something that they feel they have an absolute right to do. So for them to be pointing fingers at China and looking at this as provocation is really more of a projection by the empire itself. But in the end, this is all about trying to undermine China and to make it comfortable the idea of U.S. forces being in the region in order to back up U.S. power. It's, in a manner of speaking, it's an intimidation tactic.
Mr. Dean, I saw you nodding there. Do you agree with Jason's comments?
Oh, sure, absolutely. It's just part of the, as I said, the Cold War game, kind of hype things up. And as we've seen, it was done with Russia. Once the U.S. began its efforts of moving up NATO to the border, Russia had to shift, which it didn't want to do, from putting resources into building up their domestic economy, which was critical to their long-term success. And they had to start diverting some of that money into upgrading their military, which they had not planned to be putting a lot of money into it. They were forced to do it. And China's now in the process of doing the same thing with their Navy, air defenses, but it's about a decade, 1 decade process to really be able to have the coastline to defend, to do, and they're about 2 years into it now. So the U.S. has an advantage now that they're not going to have in 8 more years when China's Navy and also its air defenses are going to be much more substantial than they are now.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Jim W. Dean joining us from Grand Rapids. Also thanks to political commentator Jason Unruhe joining us from Niagara Falls. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review. But do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV.